3 seconds. That's how long it takes for a fire to consume a room. Not a minute, not 30 seconds. 3. Nora Vasquez had learned that in the mandatory hotel safety training she'd sat through 6 months ago, in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner, half listening, because she needed the job and the job required it. She had not expected to use that information on a Thursday night in November, standing in the hallway of the 42nd floor of the Alderton Grand, watching smoke pour under the door of Suite 4201, while the fire alarm screamed above her head and every instinct in her body told her to run. She didn't run. The woman inside couldn't. Nora had seen her earlier that evening. Eleanor Caruso, 73 years old, the mother of Vincent Caruso, the man who owned half the waterfront property in Boston, and whose name appeared in the news more often than the mayor's, though never in the same section. Eleanor had requested extra towels at 9:30, and Nora had brought them herself because the other housekeeping staff had already clocked out. The old woman had answered the door in a silk robe, leaning on a cane with a pearl handle, and looked at Nora the way people look at furniture, registering the presence without acknowledging the person. "Set them on the chair," Eleanor had said, and turned back to the television. Nora had set them on the chair, said goodnight to a woman who didn't respond, and walked back out into the hallway. That was 40 minutes ago. Now the door to Suite 4201 was hot against her palm. The evacuation protocol said to never open a hot door. The evacuation protocol also assumed the person inside was capable of opening it herself. Nora grabbed the master key from her belt, pressed her shoulder to the wall, turned her face away, and pushed the door open. The smoke hit her first, thick, chemical, from the overloaded power strip the investigation would later confirm had shorted behind the television cabinet. The room wasn't fully on fire yet. The curtains were. One wall was. The carpet near the window was a creeping orange line advancing toward the bed, where Eleanor Caruso sat upright against the headboard, her cane on the floor 5 feet away, her face a mask of absolute terror. "Come on," Nora said, already moving through the smoke. Her eyes were burning. "We have to go right now. I can't walk without." Eleanor started. "I know." Nora grabbed the cane from the floor and pressed it into Eleanor's hand, then got her arm around the old woman's waist and pulled her upright. Eleanor was heavier than she looked, or maybe fear had made Nora's arms weak. Either way, they moved. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, across the burning carpet toward the open door while the smoke alarm screamed and the curtains collapsed in a sheet of orange flame behind them. They were 6 feet from the door when the ceiling panel above the window gave way. Nora shoved Eleanor through the doorway with everything she had, throwing her own body sideways against the doorframe to get them both clear. The panel came down behind them in a shower of burning debris. Nora felt the heat across her back like a brand, a single searing line from her left shoulder down to her hip, the kind of pain that arrives a half-second after the fact, delayed and then enormous. She didn't stop moving. She got Eleanor 3 doors down the hallway, around the corner, to the fire door, and sat her down on the stairwell landing before her legs gave out. She slid down the wall and landed on the floor. The back of her uniform was smoldering. She didn't realize it until a firefighter coming up the stairs ripped his jacket off and pressed it against her back, and she screamed. "You're okay," the firefighter said. "You're okay. Stay with me." Nora was aware, distantly, of Eleanor Caruso crouching beside her on the landing, crouching, on arthritic knees, on a floor that couldn't have been comfortable, holding Nora's hand with both of hers and saying something that got lost in the ringing in Nora's ears. The last thing she registered clearly before the pain took over was the sound of the stairwell door banging open below and a man's voice, authoritative and cracked at the edges in a way that didn't belong to it, shouting his mother's name. The Alderton Grand had a private medical suite on the 4th floor, available by arrangement and used primarily by guests who required discretion. Nora learned this after waking up in it, which took longer than she would have expected. The burn was a 2nd-degree stripe across her left back and shoulder, covering roughly 30% of that side. The smoke inhalation was moderate. The doctor who explained this to her was a small, careful man named Dr. Okonkwo, who used words like manageable and recovery trajectory, and watched Nora's face while he spoke the way people do when they're waiting for a reaction and aren't sure what form it will take. "How long?" Nora asked. "The wound itself, with proper treatment, 6 to 8 weeks. The scarring, I meant how long was I out? 14 hours, Dr. Okonkwo said. It's Friday morning." Nora closed her eyes. Her shift on Thursday had started at 2 in the afternoon. She had been on the clock when the fire started. She thought, with a distant practical clarity that surprised her, about whether the hotel's workers' compensation covered this, and then thought about Marcus, and then the practical clarity collapsed entirely, and she had to work very hard to keep her face neutral. Marcus Vasquez was her younger brother by 7 years. He was 22, and he was currently 80 miles away in a residential treatment facility in Worcester, Massachusetts, 31 days into a 90-day program for opioid dependency. The program cost $4,000 a month. Nora's hotel job paid $15 an hour. She had been doing the math badly for weeks, picking up extra shifts, skipping meals she pretended she wasn't skipping, telling Marcus on their Sunday phone calls that everything was fine, that she had it handled. She did not have it handled. The second monthly payment was due in 8 days. "Is there someone I should contact?" Dr. Okonkwo asked. "No," Nora said. "I'm fine." She was lying on her stomach because of the burn dressing, her cheek against the pillow, staring at the wall. The room was nicer than any room she had ever slept in. The irony of that was not lost on her. The door opened. Nora assumed it was a nurse. She didn't turn her head. Then she felt the quality of the silence change. A heaviness entered the room that she associated, without quite knowing why, with the presence of someone accustomed to commanding space. "Miss Vasquez." She turned her head. Vincent Caruso was not what the newspapers made him look like. The photographs were always formal. Suits, podiums, ribbon-cutting ceremonies for buildings that bore his family's name on the cornerstone. In person at 7-something in the morning in the medical suite of his hotel, he looked like a man who had not slept. His shirt was open at the collar. There was a burn on his left forearm that someone had bandaged badly, and he hadn't fixed it. He was standing in the doorway of her room, with his hands at his sides and an expression on his face that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not the cool composure she'd expected, not pity exactly. Something rawer than either. "Mr. Caruso," Nora said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He walked into the room and pulled a chair up to the side of the bed and sat down, which was not what she expected him to do. She expected a brief condolence, a handshake, an HR representative appearing at his elbow with a form. Instead, he sat down, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at her with those dark, still eyes for a long moment without speaking. "How is your mother?" Nora asked, because the silence needed filling, and it was the thing she actually wanted to know. Something moved across his face. "Unharmed," he said. "Not a scratch. She's at our family home in Brookline." He paused. "She's been asking about you since 3 this morning." "I'm glad she's okay," Nora said. "You pulled her through a burning room," Vincent said. "With your back already?" He stopped. Started again. "The fire investigator said the panel came down while you were in the doorway. I'm aware. You pushed her clear first. She couldn't move quickly enough on her own." "I know." His jaw moved. "I know that. I'm trying to." He exhaled, a short, controlled sound. "I'm trying to tell you something, and I'm apparently doing it badly." Nora waited. "No one told her to do that," he said, and she realized he was speaking quietly, almost to himself. "My security team was on a lower floor." The duty manager froze. Every trained professional in that building made a calculation about risk and came out on the wrong side of it, and a housekeeping attendant who was supposed to be off the clock ran into a burning suite for a woman who hadn't even said thank you for the towels. Nora didn't say anything. "How did you know she was still in there?" he asked. "The evacuation board in the service corridor. Her key card hadn't been logged at any exit." He looked at her for a moment. "You checked the evacuation board. I was trained to." She paused. "I actually was listening in the safety training." Something shifted in his face that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't quite make it. "What do you need?" he asked instead. "Right now, today, what do you need?" Nora thought about the correct answer to that question, and the honest answer, and how far apart they were from each other. "I'm okay," she said.
"I'll be fine."
Vincent Caruso looked at her the way a man looks at a door he knows is locked and is deciding whether to pick it or knock. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out his phone, set it on the table beside the water pitcher where she could reach it, and stood up. "Not an assistant. Not the front desk. If you need something, call it." He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the frame. His back was to her. "Miss Vasquez," he said. "What is your first name?" "Nora." He was quiet for a second. "Nora." Like he was confirming it to himself. "Thank you." He walked out. The door closed softly. Nora stared at the ceiling and thought about 8 days and $4,000, and then she stopped thinking about it because there was nothing to think, and closed her eyes. She called the facility at noon. She was still lying on her stomach, talking into the phone propped against the pillow, her voice low so the nurse stationed outside wouldn't hear. The woman at the billing desk at Worcester Recovery was polite in the professional way that means nothing personal, just the law. "We do need to see that second payment by the 14th, Ms. Vasquez. I understand you've been dealing with a difficult situation." "My brother is 31 days in," Nora said. "He's doing well. His counselor said he's doing well." "We're very glad to hear that. But our policy, I understand this policy." Nora closed her eyes. "By the 14th. She hung up and lay still for a while. She didn't call the number on Vincent Caruso's phone. She didn't call anyone. She did the math again, the same math she'd been doing for weeks, and got the same answer. And then she got a different answer. Because she would not be working for 6 to 8 weeks, and even with workers' compensation, which she was not certain she qualified for under current circumstances, the numbers did not reach $4,000 by the 14th. At 2 in the afternoon, the door opened and it was not the nurse. It was Eleanor Caruso. She was in a proper dress, leaning on her pearl-handled cane, her white hair pinned precisely, her lipstick a careful red. She looked, Nora thought, like a woman who put on armor every morning before she let the world see her. She crossed the room, without asking permission, and sat in the same chair her son had occupied that morning. She looked at Nora, really looked, the first time she had in all the months Nora had been assigned to her floor. "You look terrible," Eleanor said. "I'm aware," Nora said. Eleanor's mouth did something complicated. "I was rude to you last night," she said, "with the towels. You were a guest. I was staff. That isn't a defense, and you know it." The old woman's voice was dry and sharp as good whiskey, and Nora understood suddenly where Vincent Caruso had learned to occupy a room. "I have been rude to a great many people over a great many years because it was easier than learning their names, and you were one of them, and then you ran into a fire for me." She stopped. "I want to know why." Nora considered the question seriously. "You couldn't get to the door on your own. You could have called for help and waited. There wasn't time. There was a risk, yes." Eleanor studied her. "You didn't calculate it," Nora said. "The numbers just came out that way." The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then, Watty went very still. "I'm sorry." "The nurses talk," Eleanor said, not unkindly, "and my son listens better than people give him credit for." "His name, please, Marcus," Nora said after a moment. "How much, Mrs. Caruso?" "I don't, Nora." The use of her name, direct and unadorned, stopped her cold. "I have been kept safe by men with guns my entire adult life, and not one of them ever thought to check an evacuation board." She leaned forward slightly on the cane. "How much, and by when?" Nora told her. The number felt small and enormous at the same time, the way debt always does when you say it out loud. Eleanor nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion. She reached into her handbag and took out a phone and made a call and spoke for approximately 45 seconds in a tone that made it clear the person on the other end had no meaningful role in the outcome of the conversation. She hung up and looked at Nora. "Marcus's remaining balance is paid," she said, "through the end of his program and through 2 years of aftercare following. Do not argue with me about it." Nora opened her mouth. "I said, do not," Eleanor repeated. The silence that followed was the kind that arrives after something irreversible has happened. Nora was aware of her own breathing, and the sound of the city outside the window, and the fact that her eyes were burning in a way that had nothing to do with smoke. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally. "You don't need to," Eleanor said. "You already did." She stood slowly, settling her weight on the cane. "Rest now. I'll come again tomorrow." She said it the way people say things that are not offers but plans, and then she walked to the door and paused. "Nora," she said without turning around. "What did you burn your back on? A ceiling panel?" Coming down in the doorway, Eleanor was quiet. "I thought it was the door frame," she said finally. "I thought you hit the door frame getting me out." "The panel," Nora stopped. "It doesn't matter now. It matters very much." Eleanor's voice was lower. "To me. It matters very much to me." She opened the door and walked out without another word, and Nora lay in the too nice room in the too quiet building and listened to the city outside and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was the particular exhaustion that arrives after you've been carrying something alone for so long that you've forgotten what it felt like before. The physical therapy was harder than the injury. Nora had been given the Caruso family's private rehabilitation suite in their Brookline townhouse, which she had resisted for exactly 4 days before Dr. Okonkwo explained in measured clinical terms that her 1-bedroom apartment in Dorchester was not an appropriate environment for a second-degree burn recovery requiring twice-daily dressing changes and monitored movement restriction. She had agreed because she was running out of arguments and because the apartment's radiator had been broken since October and she'd been too tired to fight the landlord about it. The east wing of the Caruso townhouse was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. The radiators worked. The windows were tight. At night, the building held the heat like it had been built specifically to keep the cold out, and Nora, who had grown up with a mother who turned the thermostat down to 62 every night to save on the bill, lay in the dark on her first night there and felt the warmth, and felt something inside her that had been braced for a very long time slowly begin to lower its guard. She saw Eleanor every day. The old woman came to the sitting room off Nora's suite each afternoon with a pot of tea she made herself. Refusing, Nora noticed to let the housekeeper do it, and they sat across from each other and talked. Not about the fire, about other things. Eleanor asked about Marcus with a directness that initially felt intrusive, and gradually became the thing Nora looked forward to most in the day. She asked about his interests, his history, what he'd been studying before the dependency pulled him sideways. He wanted to be an engineer, Nora said one afternoon. She was doing the slow, prescribed stretches the physical therapist had given her, moving her left arm through a careful arc. Civil engineering. He had a partial scholarship to UMass. He deferred it. He can still use it if he finishes the program and maintains his standing. She paused. His counselor thinks he's on track. Eleanor nodded, filing this away. She had a way of listening that made you feel the information was going somewhere, not just being heard and released. Vincent was less present. He moved through the townhouse at the edges of Nora's days. She would hear him in the early morning, the low exchange of voices in the front hall, the sound of the side door closing when he left. At dinner, which Eleanor conducted with the formality of a woman who considered the evening meal a form of civilization, he appeared most nights. He sat at the head of the table and asked Nora, with a careful neutrality, how the physical therapy was going, and whether she needed anything, and Nora said it was going well, and no. She had everything she needed, and the conversation moved around them like a river around two rocks. She noticed things about him, though. She couldn't help it. She noticed that he waited until Eleanor had taken her first bite before he picked up his fork. She noticed that when the housekeeper, a woman named Patricia who had been with the family for 20 years, mentioned offhandedly that her son had gotten into a local college, Vincent put down his glass and asked a series of questions about it that took 10 minutes and ended with him quietly asking Patricia to send him the financial aid information. She noticed that his default expression, in unguarded moments when he wasn't aware she was looking, was not the cold authority of the photographs. It was something more tired and more careful, the face of a man who had learned to carry weight without showing it. 3 weeks in, on a Thursday evening, she found him in the library. She'd come looking for a book. Eleanor had mentioned a biography she thought Nora might like, something about a woman engineer in the 1940s who'd built bridges nobody thought could stand, and the door was ajar. Vincent was at the desk, not working. He was sitting back in the chair with his eyes closed and both hands pressed over his face, and for a moment Nora almost backed out. Then he heard her. His hands came down. The composure assembled itself, quickly but not quickly enough. "I'm sorry," Nora said. "I was looking for a book. I'll come back." "No. Come in." "The biography. It's on the 3rd shelf, left side. Mother mentioned you'd want it." Nora found it and turned to go. "Nora." She stopped. Vincent was looking at the window. The Boston skyline was visible through the glass, the harbor lights catching on the water. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she thought he'd changed his mind about whatever he'd been about to say. "I was in the lobby when the fire started," he said finally. "I was downstairs with a security detail. I had 4 men with me." He paused. "I didn't know which floor she was on immediately. There was confusion with the system. By the time I knew she was already out," Nora said. "Because of you." His voice was flat in the way that means the flatness is doing a lot of work. "Mr. Caruso, Vincent," he turned from the window. "Please," she studied him. "Vincent," she said. It felt strange, and then, immediately, accurate. "It worked out. You have a 2nd-degree burn across a third of your back. I also have working feeling in my legs and a brother who is going to finish his program," she said. "I'm aware of the cost-benefit analysis." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why are you so calm about it?" "I'm not calm," Nora said. "I'm tired. There's a difference." He was quiet. Then, "What were you doing before the hotel?" She told him. The nursing program she'd had to leave when their mother got sick, the 18 months of caregiving, their mother's death 2 years ago, the ways Marcus had started to come apart in the aftermath, the way she'd shifted everything to try to hold him together. She didn't say it as a performance. She said it the way you say things when you're too tired to protect yourself with a shorter version. When she finished, the room was very still. "You were studying nursing," Vincent said. "I had 2 semesters left." He nodded slowly, as if completing a calculation. "I have a foundation," he said. "It funds re-entry education for adults who had to leave programs for family caregiving reasons. There are," he stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not offering charity. I want to be clear about that. What are you offering?" "A scholarship, full funding including living stipend to finish the nursing program at whatever institution will accept your transfer. In exchange for," he paused again. "Nothing. There is no exchange. I'm bad at this." Nora looked at him. "You're not bad at it," she said. "You're just not used to doing it without a contract attached." The corner of his mouth moved. "It almost made it this time." "That's accurate," he said. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it while doing her prescribed stretches, and while sitting with Eleanor over the afternoon tea, and while lying awake at night listening to the radiators work their reliable magic against the November cold outside. She thought about what it meant to accept something you hadn't earned through the transaction you understood, and whether that was different from earning it a different way, through something you'd done without calculation. On the 3rd day, she knocked on the library door. Vincent was actually working this time, papers spread across the desk. Yes, Nora said. He put down his pen. Okay. I have conditions. Tell me, I pay it back, she said. Not with money. When I'm licensed, I work a year with a community health clinic of my choosing. A real one, not a vanity project. One where the patients can't pay their bills. Vincent looked at her steadily. That's not a condition. That's just what you were going to do anyway. She conceded that with a small tilt of her head. Then the condition is that if Marcus needs additional support in his first 2 years out, you don't pay for it without asking me first. Because you need to be part of it, because he's my brother. Vincent nodded. Agreed. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. Not awkward, not heavy, but the kind of quiet that settles after 2 people have negotiated their way into the same understanding. There's something I should tell you, Vincent said. He looked down at the papers on the desk and then back up at her. I've been running background on the fire. The power strip was tampered with. Nora went very still. What? It wasn't an accident. Someone wanted that sweet to burn. He watched her face. My mother had received a threat earlier in the week. I had increased security. The service corridor was the gap. You think someone used the hotel? I think someone used the situation, he corrected. The fire was supposed to move faster. The sprinkler in the corridor was manually disabled. He paused. If you hadn't checked the evacuation board. Don't, Nora said. Don't finish that sentence. She sat down in the chair across from the desk, her back protest flaring at the movement, and looked at him. Is she safe now? Yes. The word was quiet and absolute. I've made certain of it. And the people responsible? Vincent looked at her with the expression she had seen once before. Outside the library the first night, the face beneath the composure, and said nothing for a moment. Handled, he said. She believed him. They stayed in the library for another hour, not by intention. He asked about the bridge builder biography, and she told him about the chapter she'd finished that morning, and somehow the conversation didn't end. It just kept going, and the clock moved, and eventually Eleanor appeared in the doorway in her robe with her cane, and her expression of a woman who has arrived at exactly the conclusion she expected and finds it satisfying. Dinner was an hour ago, Eleanor said. We lost track, Nora said. Eleanor's eyes moved between them. Patricia left plates. Vincent, you should eat, Nora, your shoulder, Nora said. You always know, Eleanor said. You never do anything about it. She said it without irritation, almost with affection, and turned and walked back down the hall, the tap of her cane receding. Vincent stood and gathered the papers on his desk and turned off the desk lamp, and in the low light of the room he looked less like the man from the newspaper photographs and more like himself. The version of himself that had walked into her room that first morning with his collar open, and a badly bandaged arm, and something raw in his face that he hadn't managed to hide in time. Nora, he said. He was by the window again, not looking at it this time. Looking at her. Vincent, she said. He crossed the room in a few steps and stopped close enough that she could have reached out and touched the knot of tension she could see in his jaw. The way she'd been wanting to for longer than she would have admitted. I'm going to say something, he said, and I need you to tell me if I'm wrong about it. Okay. I don't think you ran into that fire because it was your job. Nora was quiet. I think you would have done it regardless, he said, whether you were on the clock or off it, whether she'd said thank you or not, because that's just... He stopped. That's just what you are. She thought about the evacuation board in the service corridor, the key card that hadn't registered at any exit, the calculation she'd done in the half-second before she pushed the door open. She thought about what Eleanor had said. You didn't calculate it, and how that wasn't right, exactly, but how the thing she had calculated was not what people usually calculated in that situation. I noticed she hadn't gotten out, Nora said. I couldn't unknow it. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. Then he took her hand, the right one carefully, nothing touching her left side, and held it the way you hold something fragile and irreplaceable. I don't know who you are, Nora Vasquez, he said quietly, but I intend to. She looked up at him, at this man who moved through the world like a threat, and made tea happen, and asked Patricia about her son's college and sat in the dark with his face in his hands when he thought no one was watching. You have time, she said. 6 months later, Marcus Vasquez walked out of the Worcester Recovery Center on a Saturday morning in May. in a blue jacket Nora had bought him, blinking in the spring light, with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has been underwater a long time and is relearning what air tastes like. Nora was waiting by the car. She hugged him for a long time, pressing her face against his shoulder, and felt the solidity of him, real, present breathing. "You look good," she said, pulling back to look at him. "You have no idea what I look like," he said. "You're crying. I'm allowed." He smiled. It was the smile she remembered from before, his real one. "Who's the guy by the car?" he asked, looking past her. Nora glanced back. Vincent was leaning against the passenger door with his hands in his pockets, looking elsewhere with the studied patience of a man giving a moment its space. "Someone I know," she said. Marcus looked at her with the particular perception of a younger sibling who has known someone their whole life. "Uh-huh," he said. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything. You were about to." He laughed, and she heard it land somewhere inside her chest like a key in a lock, the right key after a very long time of trying the wrong ones. She took his hand and they walked toward the car together, and Vincent straightened when he saw them coming and said hello to Marcus, and asked, without any particular ceremony, whether he was hungry, because Eleanor had apparently been cooking since 7 in the morning and would not be reasoned with. Marcus said he was extremely hungry. Eleanor, it turned out, had made enough for a significantly larger family than the one currently assembled in the Brookline dining room, which struck Nora as either optimism or strategy. And knowing Eleanor, she understood these were not different things. They sat around the table, Eleanor at the head, Marcus and Nora on one side, Vincent across from them. And Eleanor served without asking whether anyone wanted things and told Marcus, approximately 4 minutes after meeting him, that civil engineering was an admirable field and that she personally had funded the renovation of 2 pedestrian bridges in the city, and he should let her know when he graduated. Marcus, to his credit, just said, "Yes, ma'am," and passed the bread. Later, after dinner, Nora found herself on the back terrace. The evening was soft and cold and smelled of the water somewhere below the hill. The burn scars on her back pulled faintly when she breathed too deep. They always would, the doctor had said, a permanent record of the calculation she'd made in a smoke-filled hallway on a Thursday in November. She didn't mind. She had learned, in the months since, that some records are worth keeping. She heard the door behind her and knew the footstep without turning. Vincent stood beside her at the railing, looking out at the same dark skyline. "Eleanor's already planning Marcus's graduation party," he said. "He's a sophomore in 7 months. She's an optimist, she's a strategist, both," he said. He turned to look at her. In the low light from the window, he looked exactly like himself, which was the thing she had come to value most about him. The fact that who he was and what he showed were, with her, increasingly the same thing. "Are you okay?" "Yes," she said. "For real?" She smiled. "For real." He reached out and took her hand, and they stood there in the May dark while the city moved below them, and Nora thought about the girl she'd been 6 months ago, running calculations in a smoke-filled corridor, carrying numbers that didn't add up, learning to be invisible because it was safer than being seen. She was done being invisible. The girl who had learned to disappear had, somewhere in the middle of a fire and a long recovery, and a library full of interrupted silences, found that she didn't want to anymore, and the man beside her, the one who had looked at a locked door and chosen, carefully and deliberately, to knock, had turned out to be the reason the door was worth opening.